Well, I was told by my friend Pauline Boss that I am more official here today than she is. I don't know why that's the case, but she concluded that I should be the one that would start the conversation. So I'm willing to do that. Let me tell you a little bit about sort of my preparation, because I thought I should prepare in some way, though my colleague Pauline Boss suggests that I not be too worried about preparation, but personality types being what they will. So I reread a number of pieces, and actually, before you published your 2000 book, you gave me a draft copy, which I thought was great, and I recall reading that and then seeing the book come out. I thought I'd revisit the 2006 book, and then we had a paper in Pauline's special issue of Family Relations in 2007, and I thought I'd better revisit what I had written. It's never a bad thing to do that. So that was my preparation for today. And what I'd like to do is sort of ask one or two kind of leading questions for you. One thing that strikes me when there is a long and strong pathway of work is what kind of goes on in the back region. You know, we see the final products. We see a book in 1999, 2006. We often don't see the back regions. So as a theorist and as a researcher, I'm curious, you know, if you could kind of just point out kind of along that pathway of working as a researcher, a theorist, and a family therapist with ambiguous laws, kind of what are the one or two bullet points of the trail you've walked and sort of what is most significant along that trail?
Well, clearly, you know, if you start something in the 70s, when I was a graduate student, by the way, when I came up with the term, and still working on it today, you're right that certain things happen in your mind and your thinking along the way. Probably the most pivotal event that happened, though, between the first Family Stress book in '88 and then the update and then the book in 2006 was 9/11 in New York City. I always thought I understood context and I understood ethnic differences and religious differences and diversity, but no, I was a beginner when I hit New York City. And by the way, Ty Mendenhall came in. He was with us on that first trip. While the smoke was still going and the plane was very empty. The first thing I realized that there were about 70 different ethnicities in the group we would work with and 17 different religions. And there was no way that my experience as a Midwestern farm girl would carry any weight there. And so what happened there was we were asked to do a intervention inside of a couple weeks. And I thought about all the research at the university. You're supposed to test this first and do this first, and we didn't have time. So I built upon what Wayne Caron and I developed at the Veterans Hospital in the 80s for interventions for families where there was Alzheimer's disease, and we had family meetings and family interventions. We adapted that very quickly in New York City for those families, and what we discovered theoretically is that the ambiguous loss model allows for ethnic and religious differences. Is quite inclusive. Thank God it was. But the thing about research and theory is you can't stop. Theory is a social construction. Someone will come along and say this needs to be tweaked or this needs to be changed. That's what it's supposed to do. Your group has suggested a third ring on the family stress theory model regarding context, which I think is a very good idea, and we should talk more about that, as a matter of fact. It is all about context. It's all about meaning. The meaning this terrible event has for people is what determines their resiliency. And so the meaning is not my meaning from a Midwesterner, Protestant, ethic person. The meaning comes from the persons you're working with. The only way you can get that is to listen and talk less.
Okay. At an earlier time, you and I were talking, I don't know if it was since I've been out here or when you visited University of Georgia in January. But we had a discussion about meaning, and we got back into what are the roots of the systematic study you're writing about meaning in the family science discipline. And so we talked a bit about symbolic interaction, and you've written extensively about that. And I had remarked to you that as a very young student, I had attended a lecture by Viktor Frankl, and who was all about search for meaning and about certainly very traumatic and strident events in his life and sort of the search for meaning. So as I reread some of your work about family stress models and how people in fact deal with situations that are beyond their control and beyond their say, sort of how the process of meaning making comes into that as a real asset piece, I think, of the theorizing. I wanted to ask you, and I hope you don't mind this, but I don't get to ask you a lot of questions, so we're doing this. One thing that strikes me about Pauline's work is that the work inevitably, or at least always, returns to theory and theorizing, ways of thinking. And as I was reviewing some of what you had written, some of the work we have done, what struck me is that as a discipline, family science still, I think, struggles with elevating theory.
Indeed,
Yeah, right?
Yes.
And I just wonder, I'd like you to kind of speak to that, because you'd think after so many years of people saying we need to do better on theory and theorizing, some things haven't changed.
Well, I think some of the theories about in family studies are very interesting to me. For example, marital quality, parent-child relations, that kind of thing. But I've always been more interested in making a difference with people who are hurting right now. And way back when Reuben Hill and I had so many wonderful discussions together, he was a wonderful, wonderful mentor. The question he had and the question I borrowed and built on was, why do some families survive and why do others crumble under the very same stressor event? You have that in your article still today. That's a wonderful question, and a question I think this new generation of scholars will continue to ask about. That is the most fascinating question there is. Why do some, and by the way, as a family studies person, I don't negate the individual variable either. Because, if a mother is depressed, that affects the whole family, or if a father is abusive, that affects the whole family. So I look at both individual variables and family variables as a whole. I think it's a both and. So why do some people and some families survive and others crumble under the same event? You'll see that in Oklahoma now. Again, it happens every time. That's fascinating to me, and I think my mind just happens to be more theoretical, and I like a map for whatever intervention has to be done next. Like if you were asked to go to Oklahoma tomorrow, what would you take in your suitcase? I hope you would take a theoretical map to help you when you hit the ground, regardless of their religion, their belief system, that would work for them. And by the way, regardless of their age and stage in family development. That's not easy to find, useful theories. And of course, I always borrowed from Kurt Levine, who said a good theory is a useful theory. That's what I believe. I'm not very good at basic research. I think it's valuable, but it doesn't much interest me.
I agree, actually, with that. Yes, I do. As luck would have it, I'm not a basic researcher, so this is going to work well. Well, let me.
You must tell him he works with military families, or families where someone has been deployed.
Right, exactly. And in fact, I guess you and I really started having conversations at about the time you were putting together a special issue of family relations. So more or less, let's just call it 2006 when you were developing that. And we had been doing military family work for a long time, but we're honing in more on adolescent experiences when a parent is deployed. And of course, as time has gone on, really the question is not just of deployment, but multiple deployments. And so at about the time Pauline was putting together Special Issue, I was working with my colleague Angela Huebner, who is at Virginia Tech and works in adolescence, and we were running focus groups with kids more or less 11 to 17, 18 years old. And in the course of that, we were integrating a lot of the perspectives on family stress and coping and the role that assets have in the face of a dramatic change, such as a parent being deployed. And so in the course of that, focus on Pauline's work related to ambiguous loss, and then its derivative, I've called derivative, boundary ambiguity. And so the paper that we did in the Special Issue tries to really, as the Brits would say, suss and parse adolescence experiences that are indexed in one way or another with a parent being absent and a parent being in harm's way aside from that. And so in the course of looking at it, we looked at roles and responsibilities primarily with adolescents, and found some interesting things. You know, kids, adolescents will tell you what's on their mind, and so you better be willing to hear what's on their mind. And just anecdotally, in the midst of a focus group, this one young guy, probably around 12 or 13, we're asking them questions, and he finally said, "You know, I would just like to be a kid." Okay? And he followed that by saying, "Everywhere I turn, somebody's asking me, how's my dad doing? Somebody's asking me about the deployment. Somebody's asking," he said, "You know, I'm a little tired of it. I just want to be a kid." Well, so we were looking at roles and responsibilities. We discovered situations where, because of how deployment affected often the mother who was at home, that some adolescents had to take on enormous roles and responsibilities that would not have happened otherwise. Well, fast forward, most people who are deployed come back. And then there's the issue of, well, okay, the family's got to reorganize.
Reintegration.
Absolutely.
As Reuben Hill called it.
Yes, reintegration. And so the business of not just who's kind of physically in and out of the family, but sort of who has what family roles and responsibilities, an enormous amount of flux. And among other things, that particular paper kind of elevated that, and permeating it was certainly the discussion of boundary ambiguity and family configuration and reconfiguration in that.
The boundary is ambiguous when the soldier is deployed, as well as when the soldier comes back again, whether it's a father or a mother. It disturbs the system either way.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's a period of ambiguity.
Yes. Well, what was interesting, if you're deployed for, 12, 14, 16 months, and you have an adolescent, well, there is a rapid change in an adolescent over the course of a year, or 14 months, or 16 months. Enormous change. So a parent comes back to a different child, not just a different family, a reconfigured family. And in some of our work, kids would say, "We're not sure what to do with my father." And when you think about it, it sort of makes sense. Family has had to reorganize. Who does what has been reorganized, changed, and then member comes back. Yeah.
A lot of the women in the military families, years ago, I used to work with military families, but that was long time ago. The women especially would be upset because they had become very competent when their husband was deployed. This is before women were in the military. And so when he would come back, he'd say, "Honey, I'm back now. I'll take care of everything." And they would get furious at that. And it caused a lot of trouble. This happened to be Navy families. So the reintegration, Reuben Hill was right way back in the 40s, that the reintegration was almost as severe as the separation of the families. It's it disturbs the boundary of the family. And when we talk boundary ambiguity, I've written that we're really talking structure functional, and I say neo-structure functional because of issues of equality and feminism that have come up since then. But when we talk about roles and boundaries, we're talking about structures, and that is an outcome of an ambiguous loss. When you have a father, but he's deployed, you have a mother, but she's deployed, or you have a parent, but they have Alzheimer's disease, and so on. So out of the ambiguous loss, an outcome, the C factor in the ABCX model, the C factor is boundary ambiguity. It's an outcome of ambiguous loss, but it's a measurable outcome, which I think is why you like it. And I remember the military wants it quantified. I remember that. And so boundary ambiguity lends itself well to that.
Let me ask you kind of a related question. In a handful of your papers and books, you talk about a lot of us get easily confused between ambiguous loss and boundary ambiguity. And I think you're right. I'm curious as to more of your take on why does that happen, because it seems to happen quite easily.
It does happen easily. In my head, of course, is this heuristic model. I give credit to Reuben Hill, ABCX model, and then I developed it into the ABCX contextual model of family stress in the 88 book and then in the recent update, where it is not linear anymore. It circles back on itself, redundant, and I think that's the way it is. It's more systemic. And if you use that heuristic model in your mind, ambiguous loss is the stressor event, so it's the A factor. The B are the resources that individuals, families, and communities bring to the event. The C factor, Reuben Hill called it the definition of the event, and I call it the perception of the event. It's not terribly different. And other people call it meaning, the meaning of the event. It's the most important. The C factor is the most important of the ABCX model. It is the muddiest and the messiest as well. And it is where the McCubbin and Pedersen group and I parted ways. Because I thought the C factor was pater. That's, as a clinician, that's where you find out how to help a person get better or not, how to help a family function better or not. It's what they think happened to them. If they say it was God's punishment that this happened, now I know that they have a negative attribution. I'll work to change that to a more positive attribution over time. If they say this was a challenge given to me, I'll get through it with my family and friends. We'll get through it. We know that this is a pretty resilient group, and all we say is, how can we help you to do this? So the meaning, the C factor, is still, to me, the absolute most important of the ABCX model. Because it is also the hardest to measure. So my doctoral dissertation down at Madison was, her advisor was Leanne Festinger, and she came from Berkeley. And when I first showed my dissertation proposal to her, I remember she had leather pants on. I was always mad at her a little because she was younger than I was. And she threw my dissertation proposal at me across the room and said, this reads like a damn novel, do it over. And I was doing symbolic interaction at that time and wanted to do qualitative research, and of course it was not accepted in the 70s. Phenomenon didn't exist unless you could measure it. Well, ambiguous loss exists and you can't measure it very well. So what I've written about is that if you want to do quantitative research, boundary ambiguity would be where I would go because of this advisor of mine who said it has to be measurable, Pauline. So I went to roles and boundaries. I pretty much focused on roles. So you can do that. It works and it's valid. If you want to study ambiguous loss, that's the social construction now, which is an outgrowth of symbolic interaction, which both of us like. Focuses on meaning. And so the A factor, if you focus there, you probably will be doing qualitative research. But I need to tell you that I was just in Switzerland, and the people in Geneva at the International Red Cross and Red Crescent are doing research in the field on ambiguous loss all around the world. And they do quantify ambiguous loss by how long has the person been missing through being kidnapped. So they give it a time quantification.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. We've talked a bit about, well, it's my opinion that we don't understand context. We can label something as a context, but then when I say, well, what does context do? What's the power of a particular context? And I think that's where, as a discipline, we're not really sure. Why is one context more significant than another, if in fact it is? So I wondered about, sort of continuing to work with ambiguous loss. If we were to look across situations, events that vary, whether it's an event such as Alzheimer's, whether it's a major catastrophe or what have you, is there a way to sort of assign power, valence, or something in a differential way by type of event, cause of loss, ambiguous loss, or what have you? For example, I think stigma often gets associated with some kinds of losses and not with others as one example.
And that is part of context. The context is the milieu in which it happens, the environment in which it happens. And it's hard to say which context would matter for which event, which is what you were saying. But I think as a person who is sent to the field to intervene with families who are in trouble, or who is a researcher setting up a research design, or a clinician setting up an intervention in a clinic, you need to talk with them to find out what is it about them, is their religion the guiding light of that family so that their belief system and value system centers on this religion? You really need to know what that is. By the way, I never, ever ask a family what their religion is because I'm not a theologian. It's none of my business. And if they gave me an answer, what would I do with it? I haven't studied religion. So my question to families is, what does this event mean to you? What does this situation mean to you? It's a lovely question. It'll open doors for you. It's focused on Viktor Frankl, the meaning people, and they will tell you what their belief system is. Then you can build on that. So you need to know what that context is, but you don't just ask it outright. Now, if I were a researcher, I might ask it outright.
Sure.
But in fact, if you say, what's your religion, you're not going to get anything from that. You need to say, what's your belief system? Do you believe this was your fault? Do you believe in retribution? Do you believe, or do you feel shamed about this? Are you guilty about this? And if so, why? And it could be some parent somewhere that is part of the context that is making this person stuck and feeling guilty. As a clinician, we have a little more freedom because we can explore what the context of this person's stress and trauma is. As a researcher, you have to be more formalized by it, yes.
Exactly.
But I wouldn't give it a one-time answer. I'd say it depends on the situation. The refugees in Switzerland, that's one context. You have people coming from more casual cultures into this very neat-knit culture. That's one context that bothers them. There are some other contexts. Of course, they don't know where some of their loved ones are. And then you come into a high mastery-oriented society that says, get over it.
Exactly. This brings up the high mastery society is interesting to me. I was having a conversation with another person who visited last week, Penny Ralston, who's from Florida State University. And we were talking about a lot of issues, having been in a university for a very long time. And we were talking about, kind of culture, ethos, sort of the expectation in the air, and how harmful those can be. one expectation in the air is that anyone can make it in America. Anyone. If you put your mind to it, you can do it. Well, my own personal view is that's the big lie, quite honestly, or one of the big lies, right? But so you've brought up sort of community issues, and I would call it the ethos of a community. Something about the community opinion or what the community sees as, I don't know, the way we should respond to any change or the way that we should not respond, to get over it is part of that. And I'm interested in your recent paper where you kind of really blow that discussion out about getting over it, about the notion of closure and sort of the problems with it, because oftentimes closure is seen as the positive result of change in our lives. And you would say, well, let's hold on.
Well, it's a lie. It's in a society that we come from a mastery-oriented society, and what that means is that we value production, we value problem solving, and we expect problems to be solved. When problems aren't solved, we usually blame the person who can't solve it and say, you know, they're poor because they want to be poor. They live in the slums because they like it there. We actually had presidents who said that. So years ago. So what we need to know that is the Protestant ethic that settled our country and made it great. It has a wonderful side to it. It says if you work hard, you can find the answer and you can solve the problem. And my mother would have added to that, and you'll go to heaven because of that, which is a Calvinist background. So just know that that's a great thing. But on the other hand, there are problems that have no solutions, and we tend to work with them. A lot of family social science people tend to work with problems that have no solutions, like illness, like military deployment, and the father or mother being gone for a while. And in my case, the ambiguous losses almost always have no solution. The more mastery-oriented a society is, the more trouble they will have with ambiguous loss. Societies that believe in harmony with nature, such as the Ojibwe and Duluth and so on, don't think it's a big deal because they can more easily go with the flow of what is happening to them. They never did feel so much in charge. Nature is in charge. Whereas we believe in mastery over nature. That was an old University of Chicago study, Stroudbeck and Kluckholm, which still stands with merit, I think. So we need to know that it's a good thing to be mastery-oriented, but there are times when we have to sort of hold the ambiguity, hold the unknowing, live with an unanswered question. And literally, most of us have to learn that because it has not been part of our culture. It has not been part of who we are or our training. I mean, you don't get A's for that in graduate school, do you? Unanswered questions. So just know that's what we're working with now. Some people say to me, well, if people are religious, is it more easy for them to hold the unanswered questions? And that's a hard question to answer because rather than religiosity, it has to do with their belief systems about absolute versus relative thinking. And if people believe in absolutes, I know the truth, I need the truth, and it's either black or white, it's either good or bad. Those people have a harder time with living with any kind of ambiguous loss because it's murky. You're in the fog, and you may be in the fog the rest of your life. The woman who was a poet, who I wrote The Myth of Closure with, which was in Family Process in December, they came from Microsoft. And my job with Microsoft was to convince them to hold off on having closure after 3 months. Their wonderful scientist went missing. And he was a mentor to most of the younger men at Google and at Microsoft and all the other young groups there. So I was able to help get them to hold off for a year, and then we had a tribute and not a memorial service. You can Google it, it's on the website, which is why I can talk about it. Many of us want closure because we want a period at the end of the sentence. We want closure for ourselves because the suffering of loss, grief, is painful, and seeing other people suffer bothers us. We don't like it. And maybe that's, in that article I talk about the history, the Republic of Suffering, whereby we were a republic. Drew Gilpin Faust, the president of Harvard, wrote a book called The Republic of Suffering. In there she says, because of all the thousands and thousands of young men killed in the Civil War whose bodies were never returned home, and families never had proper funerals and so on, that our republic was born on suffering, on unresolved grief, is how I say it. Yeah, and indeed, I agree with her. I add to what she says, though, it's not just the Civil War. It's the genocide of the American Indians. It's the slavery that broke up families from Africa for generations. It's all kinds of refugees that come to this country because we are a nation that welcomes immigrants who are from someplace else, so their families are somewhere else, which is an unresolved loss too. So I think the reason we fear death, and even more so ambiguity, is because we are a nation built on unresolved loss, perhaps more than any other.
You know, it's interesting as you talk about the myth of closure, in thinking about, again, the return of military members to families and reintegration, there's kind of an expectation that reintegration should occur within a band of time.
And be rosy after that.
Well, yeah, pretty much, yeah. Yeah, it ought to be just fine. And so if you look at, in my view, a lot of the reintegration focus is maybe 90 days out, maybe 120 days out from the return of a military member. And it's assumed that anything that needs to be solved will be solved in that window of time, never realizing that it may not be until 120 days till anything of substance emerges, right, because of other adjustments. So the notion about myth of closure sort of resonates to what I think a lot of well-meaning programs, if you will, and well-meaning individuals do that does not align well with the human and family experience, it seems to me.
Right. Well, the experience of having been in the military, whether you were in the battlefield or not, is just part of your life forever after that. And what we don't realize is the experiences of loss that we have are forever part of our fabric. Now, we hope they don't immobilize us, but you can never close the door. And just recently, I read about Freud. He lost his favorite daughter in the flu of 1918. And he was seeing a patient, and the patient said, "I'm so sorry about your daughter's death." And he said, "She's right here," and he pointed to his watch chain where he had a locket on. Okay, guys, these are guys, and there are many others since then who've written about closure. They don't do it themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we now have given up on the idea of closure and the linear Kubler-Ross's 5 stages and get through them and you're done. The current notion about grief and loss and reintegration after loss is that you learn to live with it. The experience will always be part of you, but hopefully it will not immobilize you. It's a much better place to be. But again, if you come from societies and cultures that are mastery-oriented, we like the end to the issue. We want the story to have a neat ending. Well, stories don't have neat endings, do they?
Right.
They just go on.
In the mix of this conversation so far, and you mentioned this, I think, earlier, or at least I think you did, we, and a lot of people here, deal concurrently with vulnerabilities on the one hand and resilience on the other hand. I think that's fair to say. And if we're doing things reasonably okay and correct, we're dealing with understanding the intersections of vulnerabilities and resilience. And I've now just said most everything I know about that, but I thought maybe we could talk about sort of your take on the mix of vulnerabilities and resilience. We did a study with homeless men in the United Kingdom not so long ago, and talk about an awakening. I was startled by how in the lives of homeless men in London, vulnerabilities and resilience go hand in hand. They go hand in hand. So I'd be interested in kind of, from your experience and your theorizing, sort of your observations on that, those intersections.
Well, oddly enough, the first time we discussed resiliency, I was on the faculty at Harvard, visiting professor at Harvard that year, and we were talking about children in the street, as you know, where the idea came from, actually a fellow here at the University of Minnesota. And a lot of the African American students at Harvard objected to the term resiliency because they thought, and I agreed actually, that it's a term that says we have to adapt to the stressor event. And it's true, children shouldn't have to adapt to poverty. It's true. And so before we talk about resiliency, I always like to say we should get rid of the stressor event first. But some things, unlike poverty, like a lot of ambiguous losses, military deployment, and so on, are going to happen. And so we have to talk about the intersection of vulnerability and resiliency. So resiliency has become a very big term now. I sort of interchange them, by the way. We can discuss it another time. The little discussion of the head of a pin, whether it's resilience or resiliency.
Yeah.
But we'll do that another time. It is a process by which all of us are vulnerable. All of us are vulnerable to loss and separation. You will all, if you haven't yet experienced loss, you're going to, because your parents will die. And so it is inevitable that we're going to experience loss, and most of us will be vulnerable to that experience. It will make us sad, it will disturb attachment issues, it'll disturb identity issues, and so on. So we need to reach for a certain resiliency that can get us through that. Now, some people are overwhelmed, and that goes into what is called complicated grief, except I don't like the DSM view of that. Complicated grief is if you don't get over it in 2 to 6 months. I think they're moving now to 2 weeks in the new DSM. So I use that word complicated grief with a small c. And we just need to, instead of looking at a family or an individual or a couple and seeing their pathology, which many therapists were trained to do, we have to see their resiliency, because that's there too, but unless we look for it, we don't see it. And their resiliency usually is ethnically based, culturally based. It's like, I know what resilience is for a small town in southern Wisconsin, but do I know what it is for a Muslim young lady from a country or an island I have never even heard of? No. And so I have to be very open to seeing that what she is doing is strengthening her, not weakening her. And it's a surprise always. And by the way, that's what keeps me going in this work, these surprises.
Sure.
Of how strong people are, how the women in India whose husbands were kidnapped, and so they're no longer anything in the family. They're not a widow, and they're not a daughter-in-law. They're a nothing, and so they are abused in the family or turned into what we would think of as Cinderellas to do the work. They now come together with each other as a psychological family for resiliency, because there's not much hope in the family where their husband was kidnapped. They have no status, no agency, no role, except to serve others. And so resiliency suddenly came when they found each other. So, and many times we see that. You can do moral judgments on this and say, well, no, that's not the legal family. But resiliency frequently will tell us that the family sometimes is not the biological family. For military families, the family is each other.
That's right. That's right. Well, it's interesting, as you talk, I'm reminded of some of the field work we did in London with men, some of whom were chronic street dwellers, 16 years living in London parks. Others episodic, some quite old, some very young. And as I think about resilience, I think of one of the really pragmatic, everyday life pieces of that. So this one fellow who's probably in his 40s said to me, you never have to go hungry in London. And this is a man with, probably not more than a couple of pounds to his name, right? If that. You never have to go hungry in London. I said, well, you must tell me about this. He pulled out an enormous chart. He had charted London. He had charted all the places where you could get free food in London, right? So I'm thinking, there's another part of resilience, and it's about everyday life, and it's about being really pragmatic. It's about food. So I was kind of, and again, someone who's never lived on the street and never had to think about, how many free food places are there in London or Athens, Georgia. It's quite an eye-opening experience. But what startled me, and it's not so much a kind of a cultural variation, but maybe a subcultural variation, that if you live on the street, you have a lot of resilience. Yeah, you have to. Die. Exactly. Mm-hmm. And I think to me, it sort of gave me the best understanding I've ever had in my career about resilience and vulnerability. Now, we did the study when I was 60 years old. I wish it had happened earlier, quite honestly, but it didn't. But I guess what I want to lead to is that how the life of research is enriched by getting involved in the field work.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. You got to get your hands dirty. You got to get out there with the folks, because if we stay in the ivory tower, we have our perception of the world out there, and boy, was I wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Are we ready for questions?
You have a final question or discussion point, and then we'll have questions.
I think I'm ready for questions.
Okay.
How about you?
Questions. Easy ones first, and then, please.
There you go.
Okay. Sometimes you have to ask the first question. It's just a suggestion.
Can you talk a little bit about gender and some of the issues that you brought up today in your conversation?
It depends on the situation. And again, gender, I never not pay attention to gender. I think gender and generation are the two most important variables in human research, actually. So we have to pay attention to them. And sometimes I'm wrong on how I see it. For example, that is one of the corrections on the theory regarding mastery, in that I have said that I believe I call one of the 6 interventions tempering mastery. Well, I guess I had New York in mind, where people are very masterful there, men and women. It just takes a lot of competence to get to and from work in New York and to survive there. Well, when the Red Cross did research in India, they found out that intervention doesn't work. They actually had to increase the mastery of the women whose husbands were kidnapped, not decrease. So that is a good issue, a good illustration of where gender may come in. And that could actually be males in some cultures who have less power. So rather than gender, it has to do with who has power here, who is being oppressed. And then instead of tempering mastery, you would increase and empower those people. You'd increase their mastery. And that happens across the world, as you know. Patriarchy is the dominant form. So across the world, many times we will find women need to be more empowered rather than have their mastery curtailed. In New York City, that was not necessarily the case, and so I would, rather than generalize, look at each group I'm working with and just say, any of you who are working out there in the field, Ty, you've been out there, you would just assess the context there and see what the empowerment is and who you have to empower and whose mastery you may have to temper. Now, in the military, that's all outlined with the stripe on the shoulder, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I always thought that was clearer there than anywhere else.
Yeah. Getting back to some of the adolescent work we've done, you're looking at how do boys and girls talk about the deployment experience and what they do. And I don't know so much about adolescents in general, quite honestly. Luckily, I have smart friends who do. But we saw a pattern where when we asked boys and girls, well, what do you do when you worry and get upset and all of that, related to when usually a father is deployed, girls tend to reach out, tend to be more associative, if you will. Yeah. And the boys we talk to, they tend to not, well, they really don't have much sense of how you do that, quite honestly, is our impression. And boys tend to talk more about kind of some very traditional things that boys have talked about forever. I'm surprised they still do, but like, I play more sports. We heard more of that. It was a sort of a traditional, I think, kind of split on it, which surprised us a little bit. But beyond that, we've not really paid attention to gender per se. Yeah.
I wrote a lot about gender in the book, Loving Someone Who Has Dementia, because the caregiving styles differ primarily amongst men and women. Men are more managerial, more cognitive, and women tend to give care more emotion-focused caregiving. And what might be the best way to give care is a combination of both. Because if you get too emotion-focused, you might also get depressed with caregiving. And managerial, if you're too managerial, you might not be paying attention to feelings, your own and the feelings of the person you're caring for. So we're trying to make a point that men and women could learn from each other, that the healthiest caregiver, the caregiver who doesn't get sick themselves, is the one who does both emotion-focused and managerial type caregiving.
I have a question. I mentioned to Jay the other day, I've got a little theory piece that's been on the back burner for a long time, and this discussion has gotten my mind on it again. It's the idea of positive emotions and the role that they may play in building resources and also broadening mindsets. And so I wrote a little question here on the side for you. I was wondering if you could speak to the idea of positive emotions as both a resource and effects on perception. How positive emotions may change people's perceptions.
You're talking about Seligman?
Yes, Seligman,
Okay.
Robert Fredrickson's brought in build theory.
Well, I have a couple thoughts on that. First of all, it's the happiness era right now in psychology, and that's a little bit more about we want closure. We want to be happy. It's odd that it's coming up right at the time that the baby boom population is beginning to experience massive loss, their parents and soon their mates and themselves. And I like Seligman's work a lot and have actually built on the earlier stuff. But the jump for happiness, I just want to say be careful. Because we have negative emotions too, one of them being sadness. And that's the one Americans are so scared of. The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker should be followed now by another book, the Denial of Sadness in our culture. We can't stand it when somebody is sad. In fact, we have to declare them depressed. That means they're sick.
That's right.
And then we give them a pill and hope they'll get over it. And do you know what the treatment for sadness is? Human connection.
That's right.
human connection. And it doesn't mean you have to talk to that person, but at least go and say hi and put your arm around them, or say, I'm here for you. And mostly when, I just had that example again, something happened to a family and the person said, I don't think I should go and see them right now because they're sad. It's the exact time you should go. But don't chat, don't ask too much of them, but just go and sit with them, like sitting. That's what sitting Shiva is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. Speaking of Frankl, he wrote about even decades and decades ago, Americans and the happiness need. Yes, he did. Absolutely. And of course, he talked about that it's fraught with danger, as Pauline has pointed out. And you know, we resonate. The work I've done with Gary Bowen and Jim Martin, we talk about connections all the time, which on the one hand seems so simple that why should anybody talk about it? Well, we need to talk about it as long as people don't realize that the simple connectivity interpersonally makes an enormous difference. And yeah, and I think the issue, this is interesting, we talked briefly the other day, why is it not okay to be sad?
Right. It's not.
Yeah.
It needs to be.
Yeah.
But I want to also encourage you to go on. If you like the happiness theory, if you like the positive emotion theory, tell me what you're going to do with it.
I want to connect it to social capital and the idea of connecting. The idea...
Which families are you trying to help?
That's a good question.
How are you trying to make a difference?
Yeah, those are all good questions.
Okay, that's how I anchor it somehow. Because our research people, whether we're military or NIH or what, is paid for by the people of this country. And therefore we need to serve. I think as researchers we are serving the people who paid for our research, who paid for our beautiful universities. We are supposed to serve society that we represent. And so I think we are beholden to solve their problems. Even though the problems that have no solutions, which happens to be the one I picked. So the variables you're interested in are good, but anchor them to an issue that will make a difference. Why should I, as a funder, pay for your research? You have to have an answer for that question.
We talked the other day, and it was about that very thing, as I recall. Sort of how, as a researcher, do you in fact distill it to something that will make a difference for families? And I know that's what Jen's trying to figure out as we speak.
You'll find it. Yeah. Go out in the city for a while, and you'll find it. You'll see it right there. By the way, Minneapolis-St. Paul is as diverse as anywhere around, and we don't have to go to Bangladesh to find it. It's here.
Pauline, I have a question. I really like the idea of enclosure. And it brought to mind kind of Keatsian notion of negative capability.
Exactly.
And the not knowing. And I just wanted to ask you whether your experience was in working, say, with people around 9/11, whether it was a source of anxiety or relief, the idea, given how goal-oriented we are, that there isn't a definitive end, that actually will end significantly something rather than say, by this time you will feel X amount better.
A couple of things. She brought up Keats, the poet's negative capability, which is exactly related to the ambiguous loss work of living with not knowing, living with unanswered questions. So if any of you are, it's referenced in my 206 book, if you're interested in Keats, which I was. 9/11, a couple of the first things that happened when we got called in not because we were good therapists or good grief experts, because New York has more than enough of those. We were called in because of a former grad student of mine, happened to be the wife of the labor union president, and they had a lot of missing people, and he asked his wife to call me. She was a student of mine down in Wisconsin in the family theory class. So we were called in because we knew how to work with families of the missing. And grief therapy does not work. You will make the people very angry if you use grief therapy when they don't know for sure if their loved one is dead. And I'll not forget the one, sometimes we worked with the families and sometimes I worked with the New York professionals. But one meeting we had uptown where there were a lot of senior therapists from New York City, well-known, famous therapists, who were finding that their therapy was not working. People were walking out on them or getting angry at them. And they themselves were feeling helpless. And they were saying, why don't more people come to therapy and stay in therapy? Well, they were using grief therapy. And so what I had to tell them was what Keats said. You have to work with them about not having an answer to whether or not their loved one is alive. And before you can do that with families, you have to be able to tolerate ambiguity yourself. And we don't teach that in grad schools. So, and many of us have a hard time with it. I told you, I come from a Calvinist background. Probably that's why I've spent 40 years studying this. I like an answer to a problem. But I've now learned over the years that it's also very satisfying to be able to hold an unanswered question and not be destroyed by that. That deepens one's humanity. You get stronger. It deepens your resilience. You are more resilient than for the rest of life when it doesn't go your way all the time. Do we have one more question?
Well, I don't want to ask if someone else has, because anyone else? So my question is, my belief may be wrong, but let me identify my belief and then I'd like you to talk about it a little bit. I don't think, at least here in the United States, we do a very good job among our families in socializing children and even as adults, partners, how to talk about a language about feelings. So when you ask questions like, what does it mean to you? Talk a little bit about whether you believe at all around your thoughts about my belief. And then how does that work when you ask questions like when people say, what does that mean to you? When they really don't have a very rich language to talk about at least the feeling part of meaning.
It may not be a feeling. Frequently when I say, what does that mean to you? It really is about, is this a challenge or is this a punishment being given to me by some outside force? And I've never had any trouble getting an answer from that, even with people who are not very educated. When it isn't talking about feelings the way we do, sort of middle-class people talk about feelings. It's more primitive, but it's all I need at the time to know how to begin, to know who this person is. What does this mean to you? Because if they're full of shame and blame and guilt, then I know that. Or if they're saying, I got another challenge, I think I can manage it, then I'm more into Antonovsky's sense of coherence, where I think if they believe they can manage what just happened, that's huge. And then I know how to work with them. So even primitive, uneducated people will answer that question. It's a pretty good Rorschach question. Do you want to answer the first part of her question?
I'm reminded of a story. We were doing some work in Maine, some work with adolescents, and had a focus group, and met for about 40 minutes, and it was about deployment experiences and all that. And the group broke up, and we brought all kinds of candy for kids, which is probably a wrong thing to do, but we had buckets of sweets for these adolescents, and they're just diving into the buckets. But I'm sitting there because I don't really want that stuff, and I noticed that there's someone standing next to me, and I hear a very tiny voice say, "We can't talk about any of this in our family."
Oh.
Okay. She was about 12, 13 years old, just a slight little girl, and she had watched the focus group for about 35, 40 minutes, never said a word. But yet after, she sidled up to me and started to talk because she felt she could at that point. And in the course of that, I said, well, so you can't talk about your dad's experience and what it was like when he was absent during deployment? She said, no. I said, well, so how is your dad deployed right now? And she said, no, he's been back for 2 years.
Oh, my.
And I don't know that that's typical, by the way. I don't want to put that label on families, but it was one family's experience and one young girl's experience about communication, about articulating feelings, about getting feelings from, or the feelings from here to there so that someone could listen and perhaps provide some perspective. So when you ask your question, immediately that memory came to me. I was just stunned by it.
Yeah, because you do interviewing too.
Yeah.
The people who need to change are us. We need to change as researchers and therapists about how we approach families. They have the information, but we've been approaching them perhaps so with more of a hierarchy than we should have.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Before you go and have refreshments, and again, I encourage you, this is a time for you to visit with one another and to visit with Pauline and Jay. When I came here in 2003, I got involved with trying to raise funds for this ambiguous loss fellowship fund, and Pauline and I have worked all this time, and it's very meaningful to have today. And I want to thank the Dean, Lynn Slifer, and her staff. It's very meaningful.
We worked hard on it.